All right, so in this video, we're going to look at a few additional methods and attributes of Pandas data frames that are just very common, tend to use a lot, especially when we're trying to get a sense of the data that we're working with. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and go through that import sequence and reading in our store sales forecasting data, which is right here in the same directory as this untitled notebook. So if you remember, we imported pandas, SPD. And then since that was a CSV file, we did a pd.read CSV. That was going to be our store sales forecasting data. And if you recall, there was an encoding issue. So when it was trying to use the default UTF-8, we were getting an error. So we had to specify our encoding to be Latin 1. All right. And we stored that in a variable or in a variable named data. And I've got to spell encoding correct. So it says, hey, I got an unexpected keyword argument called encoding or encoding. So helps if you spell the arguments correctly. All right. So in this case, right, so if I were to print data, we've got a pandas data frame. We can see the alternating row colors. We've got an index and column labels, right? And it's returned to us a data frame that has 2,121 rows and 21 columns. Now, one thing that you can see is when you just, print data to the screen, right, it renders really the first 5 rows, then all these intermediate rows right here in the middle. It's just using ellipsis to indicate there's more data here. And then it shows the end, right? And it takes up a good bit of the screen. So a lot of times when we're just starting to work with a data frame or whatnot, we might want to understand the structure, but we only need a couple of rows worth of data to kind of understand that. So a very common method that we use a lot when we're kind of looking and kind of thinking about how do we work with data is the head method, right? So if you've got a data frame, I believe that will work with a series as well. And you use the head method. So a method, it has parentheses, which almost, it indicates that we could specify arguments to fine tune the behavior. So if I do Shift Enter, we can see that what it will do is it's only going to return 5 rows. All right, so by default, what the head method does for a data frame or series is it's going to return the first 5 rows of your data object, right? So in this case, a data frame. So we can use this to kind of get a sense of what are the types in the various columns and think about how we might write some code to maybe clean up columns or do some different types of manipulation. Since this is a method, it does accept arguments. So if I hold Shift Tab here, we can see it takes an argument in, which it expects to be an integer, and by default it's 5. So this is specifying the number of rows to return. So it's going to return the first n rows. So if I were to specify, put 3 in there, it returns 3 rows, right? If I put 1, it returns 1 row. So you can use that to kind of quickly inspect a subset of your data, and it doesn't take up your entire screen. So that is the head method. All right, and similarly, we also have the tail method, which shows the last 5 rows. All right, or again, it takes arguments, so you can specify n, and you can get the last n rows. So in this case, n is equal to 3, so I'm getting the last 3 rows. All right, now, again, this is just the last, right? So one thing I want to make clear is it's not really dependent on this index value. So you might think, well, it's looking and saying, give me the 3, or in this case, the 2 smallest index values, and then return those. That's not what it's doing. It's just saying, okay, well, you might have the data frame sorted in a different way where the first row is not index 0. So maybe you read in the data, and then you did some type of a sorting or a manipulation. It's just going to return the top, in this case 2, whichever the first 2 rows or whichever are the last 3 rows. That's what it's going to be returning to you. All right, so just note that. All right, so another method that we have that is very commonly used is the describe method. Let me spell that correctly. Doing well with my spelling today. All right, and what describe does is you see it's giving us back some information for a subset of our columns. All right. In particular, row ID, postal code, sales, quantity, discount, and profit. Well, how did it choose those columns? Well, remember info. So if we were to look at info, data.info, all right, so row ID is an integer. All right. Postal code is an integer. Sales is a float. Quantity is an integer. Discount, profit are both floats. So what it's done is it will give you summary information for your numeric columns. All right, so this is showing us that, hey, row ID, how many values are in that. So there's 2,121 values. The mean value in that column is 5,041, and so forth. So that's what it's doing. It's giving us summary statistics for various columns. So you could look at this and say, okay, well, what's the mean sales value? Well, you could look in this sales column here, and you can see the mean. So the mean sales value is 349.83 with some extra stuff out in the lower decimal digits. All right, you can customize this. So this is a method. Again, we have open close parentheses. So if I hit Shift Tab here, you can specify the percentile. So it's giving you the 25th percentile, the 50th, or the median, and the 75th percentile. You can change that, right? So if you only wanted to figure out the median, you could add something this percentiles. So it's saying, hey, this should be a list-like object of numbers that are between 0 and 1. So if we only wanted to show the 50th percentile, so by default it's showing the 25th, 5th, and 75th. Well, we could say, well, let's just do our percentiles, and let's just set that equal to 0.5. There we go. So now we've only got the minimum, the maximum, and the 50th percentile of the median value. All right. Another thing that you should note here is what is it returning to you? So again, always know the type. So what is the type of this thing that got returned? Well, if I see I've got an index here, so count, mean, standard deviation, or STD for standard deviation, and then I've got column labels. So it's actually returning a data frame. So if I wrap this thing in type, it is a Pandas data frame. All right. So the last, in this case, attribute that I'm going to show you, and this is one that is, again, very, very common, is data.shape, right? So you can get the shape of your object. In this case, it's a data frame, so it has rows and columns. So it's got 2,121 rows and then 21 columns. What is the type of this thing that's being returned? It is a tuple, right? So a lot of times people will call data.shape and it returns a tuple, and the first thing being the number of rows and the second being the number of columns, and you can use that tuple to grab things, right? So if I wanted to know the number of rows, well, I can call data.shape. That's a tuple that it's returned. So if I grab the 0th element of that tuple, that's the number of rows, right? If I want to get the number of columns in my object, I can grab the thing in index position 1 because it's returning rows and columns. All right, so these are just a few additional common methods. Usually as soon as we read in data, you're going to call either one or all of these, right? So you're going to want to use the head to kind of look at your data, and then maybe describe to get a sense of the numeric values to see if there's any values that are particularly, maybe indicating that things were entered incorrectly, that you might have to clean up, and then the shape to get the rows and columns.